Okie doke. Chapter 5 is called Male Sexual Being. As you might assume, be prepared for some content that might be heavy or the type of information you might want to prepare yourself for. Particularly like a lot of like rape culture reference and sexual abuse type of stuff that you might naturally correlate with patriarchal masculinity. And then that's it. That's all I have to say. Besides that, today I'm going to use these canopies as the backdrop because aren't canopies awesome? Chapter 5, Male Sexual Being. Most men and women are not having satisfying and fulfilling sex. We have all heard the notion that men come to relationships looking for sex and not love, and that women come to relationships looking for love and not sex. In actuality, men come to sex hoping that it will provide them with all the emotional satisfaction that would come from love. Most men think that sex will provide them with a sense of being alive, connected, that sex will offer closeness, intimacy, pleasure. And more often than not, sex simply does not deliver the goods. This fact does not lead men to cease obsessing about sex. It intensifies their lust and their longing. If women have been taught through sexist socialization that a journey through the difficult terrain of sex will lead us to our heart's desire, men have been taught that their heart's desire should be for sex and more sex. Coming in the wake of sexual liberation, women's liberation seemed to promise heterosexual and bisexual men that women would begin to think the same way males do about sexuality, that female sexuality would become just as predatory, just as obsessive as male sexual desire. Lots of men thought this was a promise of paradise. Finally, they were going to be able to go for the sexual gusto without having to worry about commitment. Sexist logic had convinced them, and convinces them still, that they can have connection and intimacy without commitment. That, quote, have a dick will travel, unquote, meant their needs could and would be met on command at any time, anywhere. In our culture, these attitudes towards sexuality have been embraced by most men and many post-sexual liberation, post-feminist women. They are at the root of our cultural obsession with sex. When I first began to write books on love, to talk to lone individuals and then large audiences about this subject, I realized it was practically impossible to have a serious discussion about love. That discussions of love, especially public conversations, are taboo in our society. Yet everyone talks about sex. We see all manner of sexual scenes in our television and movie screens. Talking about sex is acceptable. Talk shows engage in audiences daily with explicit discussions of sexuality. Discussions of sex are fundamentally easier to engage in because in patriarchal culture, sex has been presented to us as a natural desire. Quote unquote, natural desire. Most folks believe we are hardwired biologically to long for sex, but they do not believe we are hardwired to long for love. Almost everyone believes that we can have sex without love. Most folks do not believe that a couple can have love in a relationship if there is no sex. Feminist movement was able to challenge and change notions of female inequality on many fronts, particularly in such arenas as work, education, and religion. However, sexism continues to shape the ways most people think about sexual relations. No matter how many men in our nation are celibate or have only occasional sexual experiences, people still believe that sex is something men have to have. Underlying this assumption is the belief that if men are not sexually active, they will act out or go crazy. This is why male-on-male sexual violence is accepted in our nation's prisons. This is why rape, whether date rape, marital rape, or stranger rape, is still not deemed a serious crime. This is why the rape of children, especially when conducted by mild-mannered nice men, is allowed. If this were not so, celebrities accused of sexually abusing children would no longer be cultural icons. The assumption that he's got to have it underlies much of our culture's acceptance of male sexual violence. It is why many people continue to believe that anyone who is raped may have asked for it by quote-unquote seductive dress or behavior, no matter how many television programs have aired the facts about sexual violence. Children today learn more about sex from mass media than any other source. Whether watching daytime soap operas or a porn channel or X-rated movies, children in our nation are more aware of the body and of sexuality than ever before. Yet much of what they are learning about sexuality conforms to outmoded patriarchal scripts about the sexual nature of men and women, of masculine and feminine. They learn that in the world of sexual relations, there is always a dominant party and a submissive party. They learn that males should dominate females, that strong men should dominate weaker men. They learn that whether he is homosexual or heterosexual, a man deprived of sexual access will ultimately be sexual with anybody. If deprived long enough, even if he is straight, he will have sex with another man. If he's gay, deprivation will lead him to engage in desperate sexual acts with women. Again and again, children hear the message from mass media that when it comes to sex, he's got to have it. Adults may know better from their own experience, but children become true believers. They think that men will go mad if they cannot act sexually. This is a logic that produces what feminist thinkers call a rape culture. Males, whether gay or straight, learn early on in life that one of the primary rewards offered to them for obedience to patriarchal thought and practice is a right to dominate females sexually. And if no female is around, they have the right to place a weaker male in the female position. In the anthology, Victims No Longer, Men Recovering from Incest and Other Sexual Child Abuse, men who have been victimized by stronger boys, brothers, and other male peers share how the logic of patriarchal thinking about the right of the strong to do as they wish with those whom they deem weak was presented to them by their abusers. This same logic has usually shaped the thinking about sexuality embraced by adult abusers. Ed writes of his older brother's sexual abuse of him. I learned about sex when I was 9 years old. I was giving blowjobs at 10. While other kids were out playing with guns, I was learning how to please a man. I was taught to be a woman. My brother liked to act out fantasies in which he was the man and I was the woman." End quote. This older brother married and took with him into marriage the notion that it was his right to have sex with anyone he desired, whether they wanted to or not. His need to dominate was the salient feature in all his sexual relationships. Within a culture of domination, struggles for power are enacted daily in human relationships, often assuming their worst forms in situations of intimacy. The patriarchal man who would never respond to demands from his boss with overt rage and abuse will respond with fury when intimates want him to change his behavior. Men who do not daily lie and cheat at their jobs do so in their intimate bonds. This lying is usually connected to inappropriate sexual behavior or to discomfort about sexual behavior. In his powerful essay, Who He Was, Eric Gutierrez recounts how he told lies to cover up the reality that his father was gay. Quote, "About the same time I began lying about my father, I began lying about myself. I didn't offer my lies indiscriminately. Rather than making up comforting details that would portray my flashing gay father more like the hardworking lawn-mowing dads that lined our street, I instead embellished his shortcomings, his weaknesses, his rages into real perversity. I enthralled my classmates with stories of how my father would tie us up or throw crystal goblets at my terrorized mother. I was an accomplished liar, building false identities for my father and myself by overstating truth on its own trajectory." End quote. Lying about sexuality is an accepted part of patriarchal masculinity. Sex is where men act out because it is the only social arena where the patriarchal promise of dominion can be easily realized. Without these perks, masses of men might have rebelled against patriarchy long ago. Little boys learn early in life that sexuality is the ultimate proving ground where the patriarchal masculinity will be tested. They learned early that sexual desire should not be freely expressed and that females will control male sexuality. For boys, this issue of control begins with the mother's response to his penis. Usually she does not like it, and she does not know what to do with it. Her discomfort with his penis communicates that there is something inherently wrong with it. She does not communicate to the child that his penis is wonderful, special, marvelous. This same fear of the boy's penis is commonly expressed by fathers who simply do not concern themselves with educating boys about their bodies. Sadly, unenlightened approaches to child abuse lead many parents to fear celebration of their child's body, especially the boy body, which may respond to playful physical closeness with an erection. In patriarchal culture, everyone is encouraged to see the penis, even the penis of a small boy, as a potential weapon. This is the psychology of a rape culture. Boys learn that they should identify with the penis and the potential pleasure erections will bring, while simultaneously learning to fear the penis as though it were a weapon that could backfire, rendering them powerless, destroying them. Hence, the underlying message boys receive about sexual acts is that they will be destroyed if they are not in control, exercising power. Adolescent sexual socialization is the vulnerable moment in a boy's life when he is required to identify his selfhood and his sexuality with patriarchal masculinity. It is the meeting place of theory and practice. During these formative years, when a boy's sexual lust is often intense, he learns that patriarchal culture expects him to covertly cultivate that lust and the will to satisfy it while engaging in overt acts of sexual repression. This splitting is the part of the initiation into patriarchal masculinity. It is a rite of passage. The boy learns as well that females are the enemy when it comes to the satisfaction of sexual desire. They are the group that will impose on the boy the need to repress his sexual longings and yet to prove his manhood. He must dare to move past repression and engage in sexual acts. Sexual repression fuels the lust of boys and men. Shedding light on the negative impact of this socialization in the essay Fuel for Fantasy, the Ideological Construction of Male Lust, Michael S. Kimmel demonstrates that sexual repression creates a world in which males must engage constantly in sexual fantasy, eroticizing the non-sexual. Exploring the link between sexual repression and sexism, he explains, quote, "Sexual pleasure is rarely the goal in a sexual encounter. Something far more important than mere pleasure is on the line. Our sense of ourselves as men, men's sense of sexual scarcity and an almost compulsive need for sex to confirm manhood feed off each other, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of sexual deprivation and despair. And it makes men furious at women for doing what women are taught to do in our society, saying no," end quote. Despair and rage are the feelings men bring to sex, whether with women or with other men. Encouraged to relate to sex in an addictive way by the patriarchal thinking which says, he's got to have it, males must then adjust to a world where they can rarely get it, or never get it as much as they want, or where they can get it only by coercing and manipulating someone who does not want it, usually someone female. In The Heart of the Soul, Gary Zukov and Linda Francis describe the characteristics of individuals addicted to sexual obsessions. Quote, "They cannot rest from thoughts of sex. They move from one encounter to the next. Each sexual experience brings only temporary relief from their craving, and it quickly returns. No amount of sexual activity can satisfy it," end quote. They explain that the sexual craving is not for sex, but for something deeper. The fact that the craving always returns is a clue that addictive sexuality is not simply about getting sex. For the patriarchal male, be he straight or gay, addictive sexuality is fundamentally about the need to constantly affirm and reaffirm one's selfhood. If it is only through sex that he can experience selfhood, then sex has to be constantly foregrounded. Zukov and Francis explain, quote, the more intense the pain of fear, unworthiness, and feeling unlovable becomes, the more obsessive becomes the need to have a sexual interaction. End quote. Sex then becomes for most men a way of self-solacing. It is not about connecting to someone else, but rather about releasing their own pain. The addict is often an individual in acute pain. Patriarchal men have no outlet to express their pain, so they simply seek release. Zukov and Francis stress that the sex addict fears being inadequate and he fears rejection. Quote, the stronger these emotions are when there is no willingness to feel them, the stronger becomes obsession with sex. End quote. Male sexual obsession tends to be seen as normal. Thus, the culture as a whole colludes in requiring of men that they discount and disown their feelings, displacing them all onto sex. Steve Behrman makes this point in the essay, Why Men Are So Obsessed with Sex, explaining that if we do not engage compulsively in anonymous casual sex, pornography, masturbation, or fetishistic attempts to recover what has been forgotten, sex nevertheless takes an addictive character, end quote. Whether straight or gay, male sexuality assumes this addictive character. Since it is neither possible biologically nor practical, given the few hours in a day available for leisure activity, for men to be in sexual interactions constantly, patriarchal pornography available in myriad forms becomes the site of sublimation, the place where the sexual addict can get a quick fix. Patriarchal men can do pornography anywhere all day long. They can watch movies, look at magazines, look at real females with a pornographic gaze, undress them, fuck them, dominate them. Kimmel contends that male consumption of pornography is fed by the sexual lust males are taught to feel all the time, and their rage that this lust cannot be satisfied. Quote, pornography can sexualize that rage, and it can make sex look like revenge. Everywhere, men are in power, controlling virtually all the economic, political, and social institutions of society. Yet individual men do not feel powerful, far from it. Most men feel powerless and are often angry at women. Women they perceive as having sexual power over them, the power to arouse them and to give or withhold sex. This fuels both sexual fantasies and the desire for revenge. End quote. Many men are angry at women, but more profoundly, women are the targets for displaced male rage at the failure of patriarchy to make good on its promise of fulfillment, especially endless sexual fulfillment. Men may be too terrified to confront the facts of their lives and tell the truth that possessing the right to engage in rituals of domination and subordination is not all that patriarchy promised it would be. If, as Terence Real says, patriarchy were a disease, it would be a disease of disordered desire. To cure this disease, then we would all need to reconsider the way we see men and male desire. Rather than seeing the violence men can do as an expression of power, we would need to call it by its true name, pathology. Patriarchal violence is a mental illness. That this illness is given its most disordered expression in the sexual lives of men is powerful because it makes it hard to document, since we do not witness what men do sexually like we witness what they do in work or in civic life. To take the inherent positive sexuality of males and turn it into violence is a patriarchal crime that is perpetrated against the male body, a crime that masses of men have yet to possess the strength to report. Men know what is happening. They simply have been taught not to speak their truth of the truth of their bodies, the truth of their sexualities. Robert Jensen's powerful and courageous essay, Patriarchal Sex, drives this message home. Defining patriarchal sex, he writes, quote, sex is fucking. In patriarchy, there is an imperative to fuck. In rape and in normal sex. With strangers and girlfriends and wives and estranged wives and children, what matters in patriarchal sex is a male need to fuck. When the need presents itself, sex occurs, end quote. Boldly, Jensen explains, quote, attention to the meaning of the central male slang term for sexual intercourse, quote-unquote fuck, is instructive. To fuck a woman is to have sex with her. To fuck someone in another context means to hurt or cheat a person. And when hurled as a simple insult, fuck you, the intent is denigration. And the remark is often a prelude to violence or the threat of violence. Sex and patriarchy is fucking. That we live in a world in which people continue to use the same word for sex and violence, and then resist the notion that sex is routinely violent and claim to be outraged when sex becomes overtly violent, is a testament to the power of patriarchy. One might add that it is a supreme testament to patriarchy's power that it can convince men and women to pretend that sexual violence satisfies. Much popular music from rock to rap shares this message. Whether it's Iggy Pop's lyrics, quote, "I got my cock in my pocket and it's showing up through my pants. I just want to fuck. This ain't no romance," end quote. Or rap group Mystical's lyrics, quote, "When it's finished, over and done with it, I'm gonna smash a blunt and knock the pussy off some bitch," end quote. Of course, the truth of men's lives is that patriarchal sexuality has not satisfied. It has fueled the compulsive need to be more sexual, to be more violent, in the hopes that there is a way to be more satisfied. Patriarchal pornography, no longer isolated, but ever present in popular mass media, has become so widespread because males brainwashed by the patriarchal mindset cannot find the courage to tell the truth. They cannot find the courage to say, "I can't get no satisfaction." Patriarchal pornography has become an inescapable part of everyday life because the need to create a pretend culture where male sexual desire is endlessly satisfied keeps males from exposing the patriarchal lie and seeking healthy sexual identities. Gay subcultures have historically articulated with greater honesty and boldness male compulsive sexual desire. And contrary to popular imagination, rather than being anti-patriarchal, homosexual predatory sex is the ultimate embodiment of the patriarchal ideal. Jensen observes that, quote, "Gay or straight doesn't much matter. The question of resistance to patriarchal sex is just as important in that gay men fuck in about the same way straight men do. We all receive pretty much the same training. Fucking is taken to be the thing that gay men do. Some might even argue that if you aren't fucking, you aren't gay," end quote. More often than not, gay males, unless they have consciously decided otherwise, are as patriarchal in their thinking about masculinity, about sexuality, as their heterosexual counterparts. Their investment in patriarchy is an intensely disordered desire, because they are enamored of the very ideology that fosters and promotes homophobia. Now that patriarchal straight men have been compelled through mass media to face the fact that homosexual males are not, quote, chicks with dicks, end quote, that they can and do embody patriarchal masculinity, straight male sexual dominance of biological females has intensified, for it is really the only factor that distinguishes straight from gay. Concurrently, homophobia becomes amplified among heterosexual men because its overt expression is useful as a way to identify among apparently similarly macho men who is gay and who is straight. Patriarchal pornography is a space of shared masculinity for straight and gay men. The images gay men seek are male, but males positioned in the same way as the male and female bodies of straight pornography. Whether catering to gay or straight males, patriarchal pornography is fundamentally a reenactment of dominator culture in the realm of the sexual. Male quote-unquote need of patriarchal pornography that eroticizes domination is no show of male power. While hatred of women can lead to acts of domination that hurt, wound, and destroy, there is no constructive power here. Tragically, if masses of men believe that their selfhood and their patriarchal sexuality are one and the same, they will never find the courage to create liberating, fulfilling sexuality. It is this reality that leads men of conscience in patriarchal society to fear sex with the same intensity that females often fear sex. As Jensen testifies, quote, "I am afraid of sex as sex is defined by the dominant culture, as practiced all around me, and projected onto magazine pages, billboards, and movie screens. I am afraid of sex because I am afraid of domination, cruelty, violence, and death. I am afraid of sex because sex has hurt me and hurt lots of people I know. And because I have hurt others with sex in the past. I know that there are people out there who have been hurt by sex in ways that are beyond words, who have experienced a depth of pain that I will never fully understand. And I know there are people who are dead because of sex. Yes, I am afraid of sex. How could I not be? End quote. Despite the courageous testimony of Jensen and others, despite the radical critique of patriarchal sex, most men are not breaking through denial and telling the truth about sex. They are choking it down, the pain, the despair, the confusion. They are following patriarchal rules. Rather than change, patriarchal males and females have exploited the logic of gender equality in the sexual realm to encourage women to be advocates of patriarchal sex and to pretend, like their male counterparts, that this is sexual freedom. Most music videos and television shows like Sex and the City, written and produced by patriarchal men and women, teach females, especially young females, that the desirable female companion is one who is willing to play either a dominant or a subordinate role. One who can be seen as nonchalant about sex as any patriarchal man. Socializing women to conform more to patriarchal male sexual norms is one way patriarchy hopes to address male rage. Since this rage covers up the pain that could be the catalyst for critical awakening, it has to be assuaged. It is not just anti-feminist backlash that has led to the normalization of pornographic sexual violence in the mass media and in common sexual practice. The desire to keep men from feeling and naming their pain fuels the need for consistent brainwashing. Male despair, often initially expressed as anger, is a far greater threat to the patriarchal sexual order than feminist movement. While masses of men continue to use patriarchal sex and pornography to numb themselves, many men are wary of numbing and are trying to find a way to reclaim selfhood. This process of recovery includes finding a new sexuality. The assault on the male body by modern disease, lowered sex drive, and out-and-out impotence has caused individual men not only to question patriarchal sex, but to find new ways of being sexual that can satisfy. If unenlightened men are suffering their version of the problem that has no name, when it comes to sexuality, they can ease their pain by breaking through denial and repudiating the patriarchal script of domination and submission. With keen insight, Bierman in the essay, Why Men Are So Obsessed with Sex, reminds males that they have a choice. Quote, directly and indirectly, we are handed sexuality as a one vehicle through which it might still be possible to express and experience essential aspects of our humanness that have been slowly and systematically conditioned out of us. Sex was and is presented as a road to real intimacy, complete closeness as the arena in which it is okay to openly love, to be tender and vulnerable, and yet remain safe, to not feel so deeply alone. Sex is the only place sensuality seems to be permissible, where we can be gentle with our own bodies and allow ourselves our overflowing passion. This is why men are so obsessed with sex. But in no way can sex completely fulfill these needs. Such needs can only be fulfilled by healing from the effects of male conditioning and suffusing every area of our lives with relatedness and aliveness. End quote. Compulsive sexuality, like any addiction, is hard for men to change because it takes the place of the healing that is needed if men are to love their bodies and let that love lead them into greater community with other human bodies, with the bodies of women and children. Bierman reminds men that, quote, no matter how much sex you encounter, it will not be enough to fulfill your enormous need to love and to be close and express your passion through delight in your senses and feel life forces coursing through your muscles and skin, end quote. If masses of men could recover this fundamental passion for their own bodies, that shift away from patriarchal sex might lead us toward a true sexual revolution. To recover the power and passion of male sexuality, unsullied by the patriarchal assault, Males of all ages must be allowed to speak openly of their sexual longing. They must be able to be sexual beings in a space where patriarchal thinking can no longer make violation the only means of attaining sexual pleasure. This is a tough job, and until males learn how to do it, they will not be satisfied. That's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 5, male sexual being, broken recording, but this certainly probably is a chapter better for intentional, intimate, trustworthy face-to-face discussion than me talking to the camera discussion. But I really appreciate this as a tool and as a way to think about. I mean, obviously it's a super important chapter because as she talks about a whole bunch that sex is like this and sexuality is like this main definer of patriarchy and all this weird shit that happens that men kind of try to make happen through sexual conquest or sexual relationships or whatever. I remember when I read this when it came out, and then I found that Robert Jensen. I really like the Robert Jensen stuff, and he's talking about it should just be obvious if we use the same word to say I'm gonna fuck you up, and then also fuck means to like have sex with someone, that we have some distorted ideas about how sex operates in patriarchal culture. But if I remember correctly, when I read that Robert Jensen thing, he also says like, I'm not going to have sex until I figure this shit out some more. And I was like, that's a cool idea. But also like possibly never going to figure it out. I mean, certainly I get non-patriarchal or alternative patriarchal sex is possible, but there's all these ways that we exploit it that seem to, like everything else, take a lot of work. Lying about sexuality. Sex is where men act out the promise of domination. It's also where, like, when we don't get fulfilled, where we act out in anger or rage. And it's also this weird stuff about adolescence, of when you're in the limbo period of like learning all these messages as a kid and then putting them into praxis. I've never heard that theory, and I haven't thought about theory and practice in that way before. You know, usually we think about it in terms of like social justice work or something, but like the praxis of patriarchal masculinity is something different. Eroticizing the non-sexual, like everything. And then obviously there's always wrapped up in there homophobia and transphobia, and what we designate as acceptable hetero acts, and then what also becomes like a punchline as it is related to sex between men or basically any other group besides heterosexual men and women having sex, becomes like a punchline in a way to like shame and control, and to basically, I think, to like avoid feeling and taking responsibility for the emptiness that is provided to us through participating in sex in that type of like domination, manipulative type of way. And the scarcity stuff keeps coming back up. And then she talks a lot about like the addiction, like there is a cultural narrative about like men having insatiable sexual appetites, and they're like addicted and thinking about it all the time. And it's like there's so many things in here that I also like hear myself telling myself, and appreciating that it's in the book, to be like, oh, that might actually, I might just be reliving, or I might just be assuming that approach because it's been so ingrained in me and I like do that type of intersectional, in the wrong way, intersectional stuff like all the time. And it's almost like anytime that you separate things away from being intersexual, you're like selling out that other identity. So, for example, talking about race to somebody, and then also like aligning yourself within patriarchy and talking about I just lost the word. Basically, when you just think about people, when you're objectifying women, and using that type of language, when you just refer to women like my body part, I think that there's a way to like be both appreciative of other people's physique and physical body, and also, I mean, this is not like a controversial thing to say, but then also like within like the fullness of who they are. But oftentimes I think that it like gets policed as like never comment on anyone else's body, no matter what. I'm gonna try to find a podcast I heard about that too. It was like, don't ever talk about someone's, where was that? I think it's the advice show. I'll find it. But the advice was like, never say anything about anyone's body, because it never is an appropriate time to do that. And it's always objectifying them, and you never know like what the repercussions of you saying that is. And I like understand that to an extent of, I also think that bodies are, I don't know how to reconcile that with like bodies also being beautiful, and like what she's talking about in here, as to like, as also for men to like appreciate and understand and be familiar with your body, because I just feel like you can like compliment. I mean, I guess it depends on the context. If you're like catcalling or whatever, or if you're having a friend, if like two dudes are just having a conversation and the thing is purely about sexual exploitation, then it probably doesn't make sense. But I think there's a way to like talk about, I appreciate this part of this person alongside these other parts of this person. I'm going to be less than 10 minutes, since this chapter is better for not on here. So I'm going to just read this quote. To take the inherent positive sexuality of males and turn it into violence is a patriarchal crime that is perpetuated against the male body, a crime that masses of men have yet to possess the strength to report. Men know it is happening. I just appreciate that being marked, because I think that the same can be said about like our relationship with race and ability, like anything where you are receiving unearned privilege and then like embodying that and taking advantage of it. I just can't, I mean, I'm just maybe like super dumb about it, but like I can't imagine that being fulfilling for anybody. And I think that's what she's talking about when men know what's happening. It's also like, dude, when you are dehumanizing people, or like legitimizing murder or lack of access to medical care because of like some stereotypical like non-factual thing, you are like getting yourself further and further away from like fullness and wholeness of you. That's the Robert Jensen part. And Tragically, if masses of men believe that their selfhood and their patriarchal sexuality are one and the same, they will never find the courage to create liberating, fulfilling sexuality. I think that's what I was saying. And then Robert Jensen talking about being afraid of having sex because of the stakes involved with it. And then she talks a little bit about the media and references Sex in the City and how often I think we consume media differently than we would like a conversation, and just like assume what writers' rooms and editing rooms and production spaces look like, and how like patriarchy is going to be the norm, and like anti-black racism is going to be the norm in those places. So like the mainstream stuff that we're consuming is probably going to be reflecting that. Yeah, so the end is like, men have a choice. And she quotes this Bierman guy. Sex is the only place sensuality seems to be permissible, where we can be gentle with our own bodies and allow ourselves our overflowing passion. This is why men are so obsessed with sex. Such needs can only be fulfilled by healing from the effects of male conditioning and suffusing every area of our lives with relatedness and aliveness. It made me think about another book that we should read, Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown. I think would be helpful. And then she ends by saying it's going to be a tough job, and isn't that the truth? And that's... Oh, the only other things I'm going to say, I mean, I say this every time, but just like in general, in this context, I just feel like to read this book during this time, that it's like not the most obviously like intersectional analysis of like patriarchy. So trying to like, what I would like to be doing is like talking with other people and like connecting these things about like what patriarchy is doing, how we are doing patriarchy to other people, and then how that like informs how we understand the death or the murder of George Floyd versus the murder of Breonna Taylor, and how we've placed different sets of values on different people's lives based on categories in relationship to white supremacy. I mean, and I'm really just interested in like how unlearning these behaviors, how thinking critically about our sexuality also are tied into, this might seem like a leap, but I don't think it is, till like how we like live inside a pandemic, and how like the decisions that the people currently in the White House are making can tell us about like how much of that place is like a patriarchal fucking madhouse. Not to mention, and that is just not to mention like a anti-black racist place, because you know there's so much history about the demasculation or whatever of like Asian men and black men, and how like black gay men get treated so differently, and how sexuality is interpreted for a trans women that doesn't get talked about in this book, that leaves the work for us to do, which is good and exciting. That's why I think it's like good to like have other things to complement this book, and hopefully people can share those things, or I'm just probably going to do it anyways. 14 minutes. Goodbye. Have a good night.